Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining for our really special panel. We're going to be talking about diversity today, and I'm joined with Dr. Sylvia Carey Butler, the Chief Diversity Officer at Kennesaw State University, and Dr. Jeffrey Coleman, the Deputy Chief Diversity Officer at Kennesaw State University. These two have joined us today to talk about their expertise, which is diversity and inclusion. We're really excited about this panel because it's very relevant to all communities, especially our community. And with that, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in chat. I'll be asking those questions as they come in. And I'll give it over to Dr. Sylvia Carey Butler and Dr. Coleman.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. And we are absolutely delighted to be with you. Anytime that we can talk about diversity, no matter what context, we get really excited. Our only wish is that we could actually be with you in person. Before I even begin, I really want to just kind of define what diversity is. And diversity is really simple. It is really all about just all the differences that exist in mankind. But I believe that diversity in itself requires that we respect each other. And so, when I think about all kind of that exists, we think of race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, social economic status, age, ability, physical ability, all of ageism, all of those things really plays a part and in diversity, which makes diversity really difficult. When you think about all the human differences that exist, it's only natural that when you bring different entities together, sometimes navigating those same spaces can make it very difficult. And so the work that Dr. Coleman and I do is to help everyone understand how difference, yes, exists, but how we all matter. So I'd like to thank Ronan for the invitation to be with you all today. And with that, we'll get started. So why diversity matters in everything we do? First, diversity makes an organization effective by capitalizing on the strengths of each member. And in fact, each member has something different to bring to the table. So it promotes innovation, it drives increased productivity. And diversity is a fact in this increasing diverse world. And before we move forward, what I will say is that this is not, and I'm going to age myself, my parents' world. This is your world, right? And we are so interconnected that if we don't, over 6 billion people on this planet, if we don't learn to interface and interact with each other and to navigate these difficult spaces, then we're all doomed. I'm ready. And this is a quote I love to use because this to me captures the challenges that we really have, but it's not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And that's by author, scholar, Audre Lorde. I want to provide you all with a historical context on the rise of our current social unrest. We've been living in a diverse world since the beginning of time. And sometimes folks don't understand, well, why now? Why the civil rights movement? Why now all the unrest? So I want to put a historical context so that you can help understand why we are where we are today. First, slavery in America began when the first African slaves were brought to Northern American colony in Jamestown, Virginia, and that was in 1619. 6 to 7 million slaves were imported to the New World during the 18th century alone. So you think about that. You think about what that means and the impact on this country as we were just developing. We were so nascent, so new, and quite frankly, I still believe that we're very nascent. But from slavery and after, 1864 and 5 came the Jim Crow era. And so what do I mean by the Jim Crow era? Well, Jim Crow actually was a derisive slave term for a Black man. And it came to mean any state law that was passed in the South established different rules for Blacks and whites. Imagine that. Imagine how we could live in a society and that there would be laws that would be different for one population versus another population. And Jim Crow laws were based on the theory of white supremacy and were actually a reaction to Reconstruction. And I just briefly want to say that post Civil War, America really truly was on in a wonderful, wonderful path. And then things broke down. And these laws stayed in effect until 1965. I also want to talk about lynching. African American males were the primary victims of these crimes, although they were not just. There were many whites that were also lynched, but during that were lynched and that were tortured or any infraction. And I can tell you that approximately, the next slide, approximately 4,742 individuals were lynched between 1882 and 1968. 3,400 of them, or 73%, were Black. And it wasn't just Black men, it was Black children and women. And this kind of gives you some historical context of why there's such a urgency that we're seeing now, why after 401 years that there's that we just as a country, as a nation that's so beautiful and so wonderful, we still struggle because diversity is so difficult. So let's talk about voting rights. Despite the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed that no state could derive the right to vote because of color, few African Americans voted in the South. And Section 1, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged in the United States by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now imagine this. Imagine that you want to go and vote. Imagine you go and they tell you, count the number of jelly beans in a jar. And if you get that right, you can vote. And then of course you never can get it right. So you've been given the right, but you can't. And most recently, we just celebrated the women's suffrage movement, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Unfortunately, it did not give Black women the right to vote. So there's a history in this country. And then, of course, we have gerrymandering. And we know that with gerrymandering, it's really the practice of manipulating boundaries in favor of a political party. And then we move to discrimination, and discrimination in all forms. First, we have housing, redlining, employment, business, including retail stores. Blacks were not provided the same access to financial support. And this sounds, as I'm reading this and I'm going through this, as I prepared this, I'm thinking about this in context, and it really is overwhelming. And I don't want you to think that there haven't been any wonderful bright spots in this country, and that things have moved forward. But in order to understand how we get to where we are today, we have to understand the history. There's an African Sankofa, a word, Sankofa. It means to look back, move forward. And so we have to take a look at the historical context. And then, of course, we look at the separate and unequal access to equality education. We know Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, it gave access to education, but not equal access. In 1966, President Lyndon Baines Johnson at Howard University's graduation, he made a statement that you can't unshackle a person and expect them to compete at the same level and think just because they're free. You have to, that's the difference between equality and equity. Equity means you're going to have to do just a little bit more to provide someone an opportunity to have a level playing field. And then, of course, we get to the relationship that Blacks have to the judicial system. It is unfortunately, Jeffrey, you're kind of, okay, yeah, there you go. It is unfortunately, and we see this right now in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I just moved from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, 90 miles away. So I know Kenosha really well. And I can tell you that when you can have a 17-year-old, and in Wisconsin, you have to be 18 to carry a weapon, who can, murder someone in the streets and not be apprehended. And yet you have an African-American male walking away, shot 7 times. It gives you pause to think about our relationship to the justice system. So let's talk about data, because I always think that it's really important when I do these presentations. It's just not my perspective. I want to kind of give you some data that really kind of undergirds this historical context we find ourselves in. So the Black or African-American population in the United States in 2018 was 47.8 million, or approximately almost 15%. Yet, Black 33% of individuals sentenced to prison in the United States, and that was in 2018. That's the next bullet, Jeffrey. And then Black or African-American population in Georgia, 20 is 3.2 million, or almost 32. African-Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate that is 5.1 times the imprisonment rate of whites. In 5 states, Iowa, Minnesota, New Jersey, Vermont, and Wisconsin, the disparity is more than 10 to 1. And in fact, in Wisconsin, where I came from, it is the worst state in the country to be a Black male. There's a lot of, in fact, there is a zip code in Milwaukee that suggests that if you are a Black male in that zip code, there's a likely chance that you will be incarcerated. So I now want to kind of have the opportunity for you all to understand the rage that's growing in across this country, and it's permeating. We think of Colin Kaepernick 4 years ago, and then we think of LeBron now. But here's the thing: I'm old enough to remember when Jim Brown and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and others and John Carlos took the stand because of racial injustice. But I want us to take a listen to LeBron James. Jeffrey, please play that part.
If you're sitting here telling me that there was no way to subdue that gentleman or detain him, or to just, before the firing of guns, then you sitting here, you lying to not only me, you lying to every African American, every Black person in the community, because we see it over and over and over. There was multiple, if you watch the video, there was multiple moments where if they wanted to, they could have tackled him, they could have grabbed him. You know, they could have done that. And why does it always have to get to a point where we see the guns firing and his family is there, the kids are there, it's in broad daylight, and who knows? I mean, if that video is not being taken by that person across the street, do we even know if we even see that video? It's just quite frankly, it's just in our community. And us, I know people get tired of hearing me say it, but we are scared as Black people in America. Black men, Black women, Black kids, We are we are terrified.
Yesterday, we celebrated, or it's not celebrated, acknowledged Emmett Till's murder years ago. So now we have Jacob Blake, we have Emmett Till. George Floyd was considered the Emmett Till of today. We have Breonna Taylor. We have Alatina Jefferson. These are just the names of a few in 2020. The rage continues. And we have to think about, how does this keep happening? And so for us to think about, we know diversity matters. We know the historical context. Now let's talk about how all of this can happen when all of us are rational human beings. And my colleague, Dr. Coleman, is going to talk about this through unconscious bias. Dr. Coleman.
So, Dr. Carrie Butler, before we move on to unconscious bias, we did have one comment in the chat. They wanted to thank you for the parents' comment, that we aren't living in the world that our parents grew up in, and we all kind of face that. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or acknowledgments of kind of how you lived your life, and our group itself ranges from 14 years old all the way to 40, 50, 60 years old sometimes. In our world where we're so spread out, what do you think the impacts of that are on kind of this? Because some of us live this and have lived during these eras that you're speaking of.
So I actually was born in the 50s, went to college in the 70s, early 70s. And so I certainly remember 68. I remember the riots. I remember all of this, the hopefulness. I remember going to visit family in Charlottesville, Virginia, and not being able to drink out of the same water fountain. I remember all of this. And the thing back then is that we only had Black people and woke clergy to some degree who were helping us. Today, why I'm so hopeful, we have young people. Young people have always been at the core of activism. And I think that we're so interconnected in this world through technology, through organizations such as your own, that we have a greater opportunity to bring down, to finally bury hatred and prejudice and just homophobia and all of those things that people just seem to put forward to separate us. But it's going to take each and every one of us to be what I refer to as a bystander of consciousness, right? Calling things out, holding people accountable, systems, friends, we're all the product of our kitchen tables. And I'm very hopeful because the young generation and those old heads on the phone like myself, each generation has had a cause, but there is no generation like the current generation whose cause is greater, because what's happening now can very well change the trajectory of this country. Everybody, no matter what you look like, who you love, what you believe, what your religious affiliation is, can contribute to the beauty of this world to make it better. But it's going to take all of us to achieve that. I'm not sure I answered it, but
I think it was perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Dr. Coleman.
All right, so now let's take a look at the components and implications of unconscious bias and how we see that showing up in the things that we do. So we're going to begin with the definition. Let's review the definition of unconscious bias. And this definition is defined by the American Bar Association. And it simply reads that we naturally assign people into various social categories divided by salient and chronically accessible traits, such as age, gender, race, and role. And just as we might have implicit cognitions that help us walk and drive, we have implicit social cognitions that guide our thinking about social categories. Where do we see schemas come from? They come from our experiences with other people, some of them direct, i.e., real world encounters, but most of them vicarious, i.e., relayed to us through stories, books, movies, media, and culture. So, unconscious bias affects us in many areas. Now, here's a quote from the Global Diversity Practice that describes some of these effects. And it says unconscious bias affects our decision making, our relationships. It helps us to understand why, despite various efforts within our organizations, we have not been able to move the dial in relation to promoting diversity and inclusion to the extent we wish. Now let's examine where we see bias playing out in our everyday lives. First, research shows that relationships form from the pool of individuals who make up the demographics of our communities and social classes. And these are influences that might be social, political, and cultural. So, for example, you have structural factors beyond your control. And if most of your friends look like you, or you tend to date people of the same race as you, it could be a reflection of the demographics that are within your community. Secondly, these interactions and experiences that come from our relationships, they influence hidden biases. Third, they can start forming in children as young as 6 years old and are reinforced in adulthood through social settings and mass media. And fourth, Charles Gallagher, who is the chairman of the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, states that when you think backwards, what you think is normal is really cultural pressure that pushes you into bias, implicit and conscious. And so this sort of just explains to us how a lot of these biases have been ingrained in us, and most of the time it's been not because of anything that we have done in our control, but it's sort of just been the environment that we've grown up in and that we've been placed in. And it could really depend on your neighborhood. It can depend on just the circles that your parents may have had, but it just tends to develop into biases, and that's why we call them unconscious biases. So, biases can exist within marginal communities, and they can exist among individuals who share certain characteristics. So, let's look at some of these characteristics. So, research suggests that implicit biases and stereotypes, positive and negative, are maintained through persistent lack of contact with others beyond your in-group. And these would be people who share certain characteristics. So this sort of just describes what I was just explaining a few minutes ago, that it really develops from your lack of contact with people outside of your normal circle. And you can take a look at the characteristics in this picture that sort of describes a lot of those factors that might influence the in-group that you may be around. Secondly, it's not a bad thing to expand your horizons either. If your friends who look like you are from school or your neighborhood, did you ever wonder how those environments became homogenized to begin with? And this is something to really think about. I noticed for myself growing up in my neighborhood, we were mostly Black, but we did have white individuals in our neighborhood. But it seems like a lot of my friends that I gravitated towards were mostly Black individuals who were from my neighborhood or who made up the individuals who were in my school. And that's typically based upon sort of the socioeconomic class that makes up the different neighborhoods in the different communities that contribute to the school districts that you may be a part of. And so thirdly, it's a cycle that's hard to break without conscious intervention. Even if someone is open-minded and willing to have friends across the color line, those relationships will never have a chance to form due to high levels of racial, residential segregation, which lead to segregated social spaces, which is along the lines of what I just described. And this is a quote, again, from Gallagher that talks a little bit about that. So let's take a look at some ways that we can manage unconscious bias. First, you want to admit that you don't know. Knowing that we don't know everything, that is, that a situation does not make sense, that our assumptions may be wrong, is part of the process of becoming culturally aware. Assume differences, not similarities. Second, suspend judgments. Collect as much information as possible so you can describe the situation accurately before evaluating it. Third, empathy. In order to understand another person, we need to try standing in his or her shoes. Through empathy, we learn of how other people would like to be treated by us. Fourth, systematically check your assumptions. Ask your colleagues for feedback and constantly check your assumptions to make sure that you clearly understand the situation. And fifth, become comfortable with ambiguity. The more complicated and uncertain life is, the more we tend to seek control. Assume that other people are as resourceful as we are and that their way will add to what we know. If we always do what we've always done, we will always get what we've always got. And so, you know, just to sort of sum this up, I think a good approach to really trying to manage unconscious bias is really just taking it from an approach of wanting to learn and wanting to understand, and not an approach of I sort of know it all, and not really trying to define people, but really thinking in terms of difference and being okay with gray areas and unknowns, right? Because diversity doesn't necessarily mean that we have to define everybody in a certain category, but it allows for us to be open and accepting of difference in all of its various forms. And this comes from Stephanie Quape and Giovanna Kenator. So relatedly, here are some steps to address unconscious bias. Number one, recognize that you have biases. Number two, identify what those biases are. Number three, dissect your biases. Number four, decide which of your biases you will address first. Number five, look for common interest groups. Number six, get rid of your biases. And number seven, be mindful of bias kickback. Now, we wanted to think in terms of how you can apply this to the work that you're doing and sort of the interactions that you're having. And so let's go over some ways that we can design events so that they are attractive to and inclusive of marginalized communities. So a key thing to remember is to take a cultural competence approach. And so by that, what I mean is that cultural competence is defined as the capability to shift your perspective and adapt your behavior to cultural difference and commonality. And so we're seeking to understand, we're shifting our view, and we're adapting our behavior accordingly to cultural difference and commonality. But and this really says the same thing. I'm coming from a approach of wanting to learn and understand, and not one which I'm sort of defining in my own terms. So cultural competence is about adapting to other cultures. It focuses on acquiring and applying skills in order to be effective in different contexts. It gives you the ability to see other societies in their full complexity and from their point of view, not your own. And it's recognizing that we all have something to learn about people who are different from us. And this is sort of, you can find this in the developmental model of intercultural competence that Milton Bennett has created, and also Mitch Hammer's intercultural development inventory, if you would like to look into this a little further. So once you understand your cultural competency approach, then you want to take a look at how to incorporate it in your event design. So first thing is awareness. You want to be aware of your own individual biases and reactions to people who are of a culture or background significantly different from your own. Second is around your attitude. You want to actively analyze your own internal belief systems and develop awareness. And then knowledge. Research into human behavior has shown that our values and beliefs about equality may not line up with our actual behaviors, and further, we often are ignorant as to the degree of difference between our beliefs and our actions. Understanding this disconnect is why knowledge is considered a key aspect of developing one's own cultural competence. Then for skills, this is a component that is about actually taking practices of cultural competency and repeating them until they become integrated into one's daily behaviors. The most important aspect of the skills component is having an excellent grasp on effective and respectful communication, whether within an organization or between individuals. And so, just like any other skill, this is a skill that you have to practice. And then the more you practice it, the more it'll come natural to you, and it'll become a part of you.
So, Jeffrey, I'm asking if you could go back to the slide that says steps to address unconscious bias. I want to go over a few things because I think that this can be a part of their toolkit.
Okay.
So right here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And as Jeffrey was saying, a part of recognizing your own biases, here's what I want to tell you. You have more than one bias. You have more than one bias. It's just the nature of being human. And so you're going to have to recognize that you have them. We do this work every day, and we have our biases. So once you do identify those biases, what those biases are, you need to start thinking about where did they come from? And that then goes into the dissecting of those biases, right? Is it because of something that happened to you? Is it because of something that you read on the news, and the news can shape a lot of how we feel and think? Is it because of something that you've read about, or it happened to a friend or a family member? Really dig deep into where is this bias coming from? Is it real, Or is it just something that I've kind of latched on to? And then once you do, acknowledge that you have it, you identified them, and you've kind of said, okay, I've dissected them. Then you decide which one you're going to kind of look at first. And what I want to say to you, when you're breaking down biases, there's so many things that you can do. So beyond looking for common interest groups, you can read books. You can join book clubs so that you have a chance to have some critical, deep discussions about the things that you're reading. You can go to movies. You can read articles and research. You can travel. The more you travel, when we can, the more that you begin to see the world in such a broad perspective and realize the mosaic that exists in this world and how beautiful and deep it is. And then that allows you to kind of get rid of your biases. But I do want to hit on number 7. Be mindful of bias kickback. So you've done all of this work, 1 through 6, right? And you're doing, and you feel good about yourself, and you're recognizing, I'm working through my biases. You know, I'm not who I was because I'm on that cultural competency continuum. But something happens, and we're all human, so it's emotional. And suddenly you have a reaction, and everything that you learn suddenly goes out the window, and you go right back to where you were because you're stuck in that emotion of why you were biased in the first place. So I just wanted to kind of really hone in on this slide, Jeffrey. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, that was good. That was good. That's I definitely agree with that. And I think what Sylvia is stated is something that lots of times we don't think about. So for instance, sometimes people, as Sylvia was saying, they may have a situation, you get carjacked or something, and you see the individuals who carjacked you as part of this group that now you become biased against, right? And so we still have to stop and reflect and sort of go back and do the work again, and remember that everybody's not like that. So and lots of times biases do contribute to assumptions, and we have to try to deconstruct those. So I definitely think that was much added value. So let me go back to the last slide we were on.
So Dr. Coleman, while you're getting back to the slide, I just want to let you guys know that the chat and our viewers are really appreciative of this.
Oh,
and they think it's a really important topic that we're talking about it. And there's a lot of good questions, and I'm writing all these questions down to make sure I ask. But I did want to kind of touch on one of the things that it seems to be resounding, and I can actually personally relate to this. My parents grew up in the South, like South Georgia.
Okay.
So from my perspective, growing up in Atlanta, I understand what unconscious bias is. I understand how it exists in the world. I understand how there's systemic racism, right? But helping them understand that has been a challenge for me. And I think a lot of us can relate to having these tough conversations that make people uncomfortable, and not getting someone who refuses to understand or acknowledge it to see the light, so to speak. Do you have any suggestions or approaches that you think might help our community get that point across a little bit better?
So we hear this a lot, and Jeffrey, I'll let you chime in and say, I just wanted to respond to this because I get that question a lot. And I always say to people, it's hard to change someone's mind. It's hard to change someone's mind. But on this past Thursday, I was co-facilitating a session with students as we're trying to unpack what's happening in the world right now. And there was a young African-American male at Kennesaw State who had gone to a Confederate store where there had been a protest, and they were in, I think it's Marietta or Kennesaw, I can't think of what city. At any rate, and they were protesting the store. But what he did, he walked into the store. He asked to speak to one of the owners. He literally sat down He listened to her perspective, and she listened to his. And she said to him, you know, do you think that every single person who might embrace the Confederate flag is a bad person? And he said, maybe it's just, I think it's an ideology. Probably not. And she said, and I don't think everybody standing outside my store hates me. And that conversation began this exchange between two people who were willing to come together and have a conversation. And I'm a firm believer that when you try to come at someone to get them to change their mind and change how they've been feeling all of their lives, steeped in the separatism that has been one of the second original sin of this country. The first original sin of this country is what happened to Native Americans. The second original sin, I believe, is slavery. And this is just Dr. Carrie Butler speaking. And so what I will say to you is that sometimes just having conversations and getting people to understand you, not trying to get them to believe how you believe, and then listening to them, they could have had an experience that made them feel that way. I began this conversation talking about how difficult diversity is because we are the sum total of how we were raised. And sometimes breaking down those things and how we were raised, it's hard. But there's a book out there, and it's about an ex-Klansman who kind of unlearned behavior when he got a chance to interact with folks. True interaction with people who are different allows you to begin that journey of understanding. Jeffrey?
Yeah, so I think along those lines, in addition to what Sylvia has shared, two things that I would add on. Again, from Sylvia's story, you hear where the cultural competence approach came into play. The two individuals in the store, they were listening to one another, and you heard in her story that their perspectives were shifted. And so I think again, the conversation, coming into the conversation with the mindset that you're seeking to understand, not necessarily change anybody's mind, but seeking to understand is a very powerful step. And I think also it's hard for some of us to change our parents' minds because they haven't had the same experiences that we've had. And I think experience is also a very strong, powerful tool. I think your parents are going to think the way that they think. You're not necessarily going to change their mind. And it may be a long process if they are going to shift their perspective. But I would say some things in response to your question you might think about are maybe what are some experiences that you can bring them to. I think traveling to another country, if they're willing to go on a trip with you and just experience another culture, if there are different festivals or plays or films or movies, when it's okay to go back in movie theater, or if you guys watch something together as a family that you can look at and maybe have discussion around. Those are steps, but I wouldn't approach it thinking that you're going to change their mind in one conversation or overnight. I think that they're going to have to probably have a series of experiences in order to shift their perspective. So
there's an excellent movie on Netflix that's about South Georgia. That's just amazing. That could help any family, even if they were the staunchest racist or whatever it might be. It's called Mudbound. And Mary J. Blige is in that movie, Mudbound. And it's worth sitting down and watching it because you see two distinct worlds, but you begin to see how people try to coexist and how people tried to break down barriers, but how difficult it was.
Thank you so much for that. I think that helps our community. It helps us a lot as well. You know, especially as it seems that with how the social media kind of churn works, people are really quick to get angry and get mad. And there seems to be, as one of our viewers mentioned, you know, there seems to be kind of an acceptance of that anger and violence and towards other people. And really, you're not going to change a mind by getting mad at them. You have to talk to them. They have to be open to that. So thank you.
So I think the last thing we wanted to do was just leave you with a couple of takeaways. In addition to some of the things that we've talked about, some of the resources we talked about, we wanted to leave you with a reflection question. So taking all the information that we presented today, this is something that you can take this question with you even after this presentation. And it's something that I think you can continue to ask yourself, you know, as you are planning more events to really increase the diversity in your communities and in your organizations and in your events. But how can you reflect the approaches that we presented, the cultural competency approaches that we presented in your events so that they are inclusive of marginalized communities? And that's something for you to take with you and just think about and maybe discuss even later on. But it's not something that we think that you can probably answer right now. But we want you to take it with you and just think on it. And then the second takeaway we want to give you is another resource that you can take a look at. This is a film that talks about unconscious bias, and you can find it. It's called Racism Without Racism. You would probably be able to find it on YouTube, but I have a link to a clip that CNN has on their website because it was a CNN series.
And we will actually, Jeff, if you go back, you know, we can make sure that you get this link if you're not taking a picture.
Right.
For the link, we can make sure get it. We can send this to Ronan.
That'd be great. We can get it attached to our media as well.
Okay, great.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Okay, and then finally, we want to allow space for questions. I think we have about 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes.
Yeah, just about 10 more minutes. So if anyone watching in the Twitch chat, there's lots of chatter about how great this panel is and how important this is. So thank you both so much for joining us and teaching us some really new things. I certainly learned a lot. So I really appreciate that. So if you have questions, go ahead and pop those in the channel. I am monitoring and I'll be able to ask that. I do have one question that kind of popped into my head. Earlier in the presentation, you talked about redlining. And I think redlining is a concept that has been brought up a lot recently. And I'll be honest, I didn't know about it until just recently and really what it means and what the impacts were. So can you kind of tell us what is redlining and is it happening? And what those impacts are, right?
It's incredible. Redlining is when you have certain areas within communities that you don't sell to people that you don't want to live in those areas. So getting home loans, it's an impossibility. And so when you have communities that you can't, it impacts the educational system because in the Constitution, having an education, even elementary and secondary education, was not guaranteed. So it's left up to the states. The states, and of course, leave it up to communities in the sense of your taxes pay a difference. So a lot of inequity that happens in the school system happens because areas are redlined. And so, only, Blacks and historically even Jewish people were kept out of certain communities. And historically, there are still documents on some homes that they could not sell to a Black person, they could not sell to a Jewish person. So that's why you can go to some communities and you wonder if they're not diverse. If you begin looking up the history of the community, you would understand that. And I won't give the name, but there is a national figure who has a home here in Atlanta, and quite wealthy gentleman, Black. And when he went to buy his house, maybe 15 years ago, they would not sell it to him initially. He had to go to court, and he won his case in order to buy his house. They had redlined it. They did not want Blacks in that neighborhood.
Hmm.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think it's important that we really understand what is going on, right, and how it's impacted so many lives every day, and what those even things that have happened in the past, how they're still playing a role today. I appreciate that. We have a lot of comments about how that it's been experienced, and how we see those things. What do you think is there's so much to be done, right? There's so much that we can do. Where does one start? What is the first thing that we as a community could do to start making positive change?
Vote.
I was hoping you were going to say that. I didn't want to feed it
Vote.
to you, but I'm so glad that's what you said.
Because I will tell you, I have so much hope for this this country, this world. I have so much hope for young people. I truly believe rather, that our best days truly are ahead of us. But it's going to take the will, the heart, and the grit and gut of individuals who are to lean in and say, this is our country. This is our country. It's everyone's country. No matter what you look like, no matter who you love, no matter what you believe, it's our country as a collective. And as such, then we have to ensure that our country, our democracy, thrive and grows, and that we're leaving something to pass the torch on to our children and your children and the children unborn. So vote, get out, get to know people, use your platform in this organization to engage with people who might be different. Maybe they're not interested in Furry Atlanta Weekend, but maybe they're interested in what you all bring in terms of the diversity that you bring to the table and how you care about each other within your community. So reach out, connect, volunteer, whatever little bit that you can do to make a difference in your sphere of influence, do it.
And I would even add on, look at ways in which you can be inclusive and inviting of the different identities you don't see in your organization and in your community. And just really think about how could we design activities, events, meetings, even the way we market ourselves. How could we develop all of those approaches to, I would say, get the attention of the identities that we don't see as we're trying to grow our diversity?
Thank you for that. So we have a couple questions that have come in. One of the questions that we have here is, how does somebody deal with kind of the cultural shock of moving from one place in the country to another place in the country? Specifically, they talked about moving into a more I don't know how the really best way to say it, but a place that isn't as accepting. How do you think somebody could go about influencing change in an environment like that, and how can they themselves handle that difference, especially as a person of color?
So I can tell you, I've lived in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. I lived in New Orleans. I live here. Though I'm in North Georgia, I live in South Georgia. I can tell you, what you do is seek out those individuals and organizations within a community that you might have a connection to. When I moved to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, only 6% people of color. It was kind of like, where can I find just even the products that I wanted to utilize? So I literally reached out to the mayor, introduced myself to folks, and really got connected in the community. And one thing led to the other, and just kind of ended up creating this community that that there's a tremendous growth in engaging across diversity in terms of race, in terms of gender and sexual orientation. And I say that because I did a lot of training with their police force around the use of preferred pronouns and when they were arresting, and how they engaged with transgender individuals when they were making arrests. So for me, it was, how can I make connections to individuals in the community and organizations? And then I began the teaching process. So just reach out. I would go to church, even if churches that, that was not affiliated with what my beliefs were, but that was a way for me to meet people. It was hard, but I did it.
And I know for me, I came from Connecticut and moved to Greensboro, North Carolina, and then moved to Atlanta. And one of the first things that I did was I asked people at work that I work with just for some recommendations for places to go, communities to connect with, churches, barbershops, those types of things, or even restaurants, just so that I could sort of find my community. But another thing that I've done, even connecting with communities, is bring a little bit of, who I am and what I've enjoyed creating, like how I've created my sort of experiences, and creating those experiences in a new place. You might find that you'll almost build like a whole new network by doing that as well.
Amazing. Thank you. That's a lot of really, really good perspective. So we only have a couple minutes left. I've got one more question, and then I wanted to kind of throw it to you guys for final parting thoughts. The question is, they volunteer in the fire department, and they struggle dealing with a biased person. So to twist that question to kind of make it for both, if you're Black, or if you're a person of color and you're a firefighter, how do you deal with somebody that is biased against you as their savior? And then on the same side, even if you're not a person of color, but you're having to deal with that bias, how do you navigate that situation?
That's a tough one. Again, I go back to the recommendation that I had in terms of, your parents, your relatives. If people have biases, try to listen to them and find out what their story is. You may find something in their story that really has caused that bias. But with that being said, what I would suggest that you do is to find folks in the department that are of like mind and willing to engage with you. And sometimes you just have to work around people. And ultimately, they will see how other people interact with you. And sometimes they come around, but sometimes they don't. And sometimes you just have to leave people alone.
Yeah.
Unless they are
agree.
impacting your, if they're your supervisors, you always have the option to do a complaint.
Yeah. And I would also say, sometimes, if you have an interaction with an individual like that and they're saying things, you might just use that cultural competency approach and say, that's interesting you say that, please, explain what you mean by that. And allow them to sort of like explain what they're talking about. And you have an opportunity to describe how you are different than that particular assumption that they have, And so you could use that as a teachable moment if you are pulled into a conversation with them.
Great. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Carrie Butler and Dr. Coleman, thank you so much for joining us. If you joined halfway through, Dr. Carrie Butler and Dr. Coleman are part of the diversity team in the at Kennesaw State University, a local university to us. We appreciate everything you said. I think there's so much insightfulness inside of this presentation, and our viewers absolutely loved it. So thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you. Enjoy. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. And thanks for joining.
Mhm.